We got a few friends from the media here. They'll give you their version of history. Now I'll give you the actual story. That is a bit gratuitous, but I had to do it. Let's review real quick about what's going on in St. Paul. In '07, we actually had a surplus. Anybody remember those days? About $2.2 billion, actually $3 billion if you count in the built-in spending increases. What did they do with that surplus in the '07 biennium? Oh, they spent it, didn't they? They spent the surplus. So in '08, after they spent the surplus, we had a small deficit. We could handle that. But what did they do in '08? $6.6 billion in tax increases. By the way, back in '07 when we had the surplus, our tax and spend friends proposed $5 billion in new taxes. They didn't get it. In '08, they come back and they get $6.6 billion in transportation taxes, $1 billion of which from the sales tax going to such vital things as mass transit, otherwise known as Joe Biden's favorite mechanism to spread the swine flu. So now here we are in this particular budget biennium with a $6.4 billion budget deficit. You know, if we had kept spending adjusted at the level of inflation and population growth, since 1980, instead of a $6.4 billion deficit, we would have a $10 billion surplus. I think it's very reasonable to say government ought to stay within inflation and population growth. But we haven't done that. We've gone much higher than that. In fact, general fund spending is up 40% since 2002. 40%. We are still, contrary to what some might tell you, the sixth highest per capita taxpayers in the United States of America. Sixth highest. Wisconsin has 400,000 more people and they pay less in taxes. How do they do that? 9 states have no income tax at all. How do they survive? By the way, perhaps. By the way, if you think the rich are getting off scot-free, the top 1% in Minnesota pay 24% of the income tax. And if you're one of those lucky duckies in the top 5%, you and your spouse take home $100,000 a year. It's a good income, but if you're both working, that's $50,000 a year. You're paying, top 10%, paying 55% of the total tax burden. Now, you know, when they talk about paying taxes on the ability to pay, I would say there's not much room left at the top. I just love these Marxist rationales. We ought to level taxes on how much you can pay. So if your income goes up, even though you don't use any more government, your tax burden ought to go up. Does that make sense to anybody? Can you imagine going into a car dealership or a grocery store and saying, how much do you want for that loaf of bread or that car? Well, how much do you make, sir? For you, it's this much, and for you, it's this much. And yet, that is exactly the way we levy taxes. That is exactly the obsession that too many in the press follow, and that certainly the left in this capital follow, that the more money you make, automatically, you're using less government the more money you make. The more money you make, you're less likely to use transit. You're less likely to be on welfare. You're less likely to even use the public schools, and yet the more you make, the more you ought to pay because of some perverse Marxist tax code called a progressive income tax. It's time to go. The Senate tax bill. We got a Senate tax bill this year of $2 billion on top of all the other taxes, on top of the sixth highest per capita tax burden in the country. $2 billion taxes on income taxes, a fourth tier for those lucky duckies I was just talking about. The taxes on tobacco and beer, and that one really gets me going. They're even going to take away your home mortgage interest deduction. That ought to do something for housing, don't you think? Where do we get these leaders? And for what? For what? I'll tell you. For what? To fund the Department of Health and Human Services, which has 7,200 employees right now. 72. 30 years ago, Honeywell was the largest employer in Minnesota. Today's government. That is not a sustainable road for growth. And now, one of the provisions in the Senate bill is to remove any time limits on welfare. Supposedly, we've got this 60-month time limit on MFIP welfare in Minnesota. But yet Ramsey County, as we sit here today, has 1,900 folks on extensions beyond the time limits. The Senate wants to make it official and remove them altogether. That's why your taxes are being raised? Hell no, we won't go. My friends, taxes are a moral issue. It's no different than the right to free speech. That's what the nation's revolution was founded upon. George Mason said property rights were indispensable to a free society. The father of our Constitution, James Madison, said the same thing. That's what this is about. It's about the next generation. It's about all the kids I see here. Whether you have the right to keep the fruits of your labor, whether you have the right to own yourself. That's what this is about. You know, take a look at the Fourth Amendment, the prohibition on searches and seizures. Searches and seizures of what? All our civil libertarian friends, oh, we got to have political liberty, we got to have civil liberties, but don't worry about economic liberty. They can't search what without a warrant? Your property. Property is the barrier between you and the state. It is crucial to preserve property, and your income is part of your property. That's why this is a moral issue. We fought, in the 19th century, we fought a great war over the rights of people to keep the fruits of their labor. Then it was the black man. Today it's all of us. The imperative is there. We've got to stand up for the next generation of Americans and not bequeath to them 1,000 years of darkness, but still the best and last hope for freedom of mankind on the face of this earth. And that's the United States, and that starts right here in Minnesota. I will tell you, let me close by just thanking you once again and simply saying that I think we all believe in faith and hope and opportunity. But none of those is possible without freedom, prosperity, and in the final analysis, the right to be left alone. And so I ask you today, a decade later from these tax rallies, are you ready to fight for that freedom? Are you ready to fight for opportunity? Yeah. Are you ready to fight for hope? Yeah. For prosperity? Yeah. For the right to be left alone? Yeah. Well, guess what? So am I. Thank you very much.